Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our national call. We are so happy to have you this morning. And I'm Depelsh Magruder, the founder of Mob United, and just want to share a little bit about the organization and what's happened since the last time we were here a month ago. So we are, in case you don't know, two nonprofit organizations, Moms of Black Boys United and Mob United for Social Change. Moms of Black Boys United is a 501c3 that focuses on providing information and support to moms of Black boys and men, really to help navigate all the situations that our sons may find themselves in throughout life. There's no age limit because the concerns that we have actually continue throughout life in terms of our sons being perceived as a threat and targeted unfairly and punished unfairly. So we focus on really equipping moms and sons with the information they need to help navigate systems, primarily the education system, criminal justice systems, and mental health systems. And you're going to hear a little bit about some of those today in our conversation. And then we have Mob United for Social Change, which is our advocacy organization, a 501c4 that focuses on pushing for policy and legislative change. So the way I describe how the organizations work together is the 501c3 side of the equation is what we can do. What do we need to know? What do we need to equip ourselves with? How do we need to raise our sons to be, informed, productive, confident citizens of society? And we're doing all we can do on that front. And then the 501c4 side, Mob United for Social Change, is how does the system need to change? What systemic change we need to push for that we can't control? Because we know that we've seen many incidents where we've done all we can do in terms of, training our sons to be polite and comply and all these things we're told to do, and it doesn't work. So we also have to push for both sides. And it was important to me to set it up that way because I didn't want anyone to be able to say that we're not doing our part. Because in addition to Black boys and men getting a bad rap, Black women also get a bad rap. So we want everyone to know we're doing all we can. So since we last met in April, there have been a few significant developments, starting with, as you know, the Derek Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd. So Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all counts. I think many of us were shocked, given what we've seen so many times before. I sat there. I remember the day of the verdict. I sat in my room and I hid from my sons. I did not want them to see me see the verdict because I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know what my reaction was going to be. So I just hid in my room and waited to see what the news would be. And even after getting what was surprisingly good news, if you can say good news in a situation like this, because he's still dead, none of it is good news. But even after that, I just had a moment of just bawling. Like I just cried so much. And it was tears of, I can't say it was tears of joy, it was tears of sadness, of just the cumulative effect of the whole year of waiting for that. And I think reacting to the fact that even with all of the evidence that we saw, it was such a clear case. It was presented well. You didn't really even need the case because we all saw the video. The whole world saw the video. The whole world reacted to the video. But even with that, we weren't sure. We didn't know how it was going to go. And just the fact that you could have something so clear, as there have been in other cases, and we're all sitting here like, yeah, he's probably going to get off. Like, that's just crazy. So, but it is a glimmer of hope. As Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison said, it's not justice, because justice is a much bigger thing that we're seeking systemically, but it is accountability. And that is what we're looking for, accountability over and over again, but it's accountability in that case. So we have to keep pushing because, as you saw, all that it took to get accountability in that case was literally for the entire world to stand up and react to it. And it shouldn't take all that just to get justice for one Black man who should have never been killed in the first place. But we continue to push. We have been pushing since last year for passage of the Justice and Policing Act, which was named in George Floyd's name. It passed the House, but of course did not make it through the Senate. But we are pushing for that bill because it is the most comprehensive piece of legislation that we've seen throughout our entire almost 5 years of starting this organization. We follow policy, we follow legislative efforts, and this one pretty much contains everything that we've been talking about, from training, de-escalation training and implicit bias training, to accountability in terms of making officers' records public, to limiting their use of force, to creating a national database of officer misconduct. It also addresses manning chokeholds and no not warrants. So pretty much all the things we've been saying that have been problematic, if this bill were to pass, at least at the federal level, it would be a matter of law, and then it's just a matter of actually implementing it throughout the states, which isn't the easiest thing, but we need that on record. Another thing that happened since we last met is that federal charges were brought in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, another case that we advocated for last year and pushed in Georgia. Our moms in the Atlanta chapter partnered with organizations on the ground in Georgia to push for the passage of a hate crime bill in Georgia. In reaction to that, Georgia was one of only 4 states that did not have a hate crimes bill, and we pushed for that and also advocated for his killers to be arrested. And now there are federal charges, a hate crime charge against his killers, in addition to the charges that were already there, which is also very encouraging. We all know that that would not have happened with the prior Department of Justice and the prior administration. So we see signs already of what it means when you vote. Like, people think their vote doesn't matter, but your vote matters at every level, at the local level, state, federal. Each of these entities have different powers. So we need to always be active and make sure we're making our voices heard, so that when these cases come up and issues we care about come up, people are on the right side of the law. So with that, I'm going to shift. And I just want to, first of all, acknowledge and give a huge thank you to Kimberly Robinson Alexander. I always say her whole name because I like the way it sounds, but she is a Mob United board member. She's also the head of our health and wellness area, Mob Connections, self-care. And, you know, she wears many hats. And hopefully you were paying attention last month, because she did a phenomenal job for Autism Awareness Month, kicking off with a conversation with Matthew Russian and his mom, Laverne. He was arrested. I can't go watch the video. We have to get to the conversation today, so I can't go through the whole story, but he was in an accident, caused an accident as a result of his disability, and then was initially sentenced to 50 years in jail, and went to jail on a shortened sentence, and his mom advocated for 2 years to get him out, and we talked to him right after he got home. Kim also orchestrated something I've never seen before. I'm a mom of a son with autism, and she orchestrated an autism acceptance talent showcase where we got to see, meet, hear from young men who have autism and hear about their interests and their talents. And I've never seen anyone do that before. And it was just phenomenal to meet all the young men that we saw who had all kinds of different talents, from art to dance to yoga, a little bit of everything. So thank you so much, Kim, for Wonderful Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month. And now we're moving into Mental Health Awareness Month. And that's what our conversation this morning is going to be about. Mental health is a huge focus for Mob United. You know, we started out as a result of cases of police brutality, but that's not all we talk about. But even in talking about that one issue, when we unpacked it, so many of the cases have mental health components. Many people who are in prison, I think it's 30 to 50% of people in prison have a mental health disorder, often are having a mental health crisis that police are just not trained or equipped to respond to. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim to introduce our guest speakers. We have a wonderful panel lineup this morning, and I look forward to hearing this conversation. So thank you all for joining us. Kim?
Thank you so much, Depelsha. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm excited to be here this morning and to introduce our panel. Usually I don't do a big introduction, but we have such a vast amount of experience and backgrounds on the panel this morning. I'm going to read a little bit about them. And I'm going to start with Dr. Sean Franklin. Dr. Sean Franklin is trained and educated in the States and abroad. He's a 4th generation ordained minister. Currently, Dr. Franklin is in the 2nd year towards completion of his 2nd doctorate at Baylor University, Department of Education. Dr. Franklin seeks to respond to the school to prison pipeline with a mixed method approach that confronts the ills and exclusionary discipline. Carol Haynes Buchanan is a mother. She's an advocate and executive professional. As a mother, she assisted her son in navigating the public school and higher education disability programs to address his attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. As an advocate, she willingly shares her experience and knowledge with others to promote positive mental health. As an executive professional, she has over 16 years of experience in health and human services field. Markathia Hughes has a career spanning over 12 years. In 2018, Ms. Hughes was offered the opportunity to serve as the Executive Director of Special Programs. These included special education, Section 504, and dyslexia. She is also the Director of the Brooksmith Residential Treatment Center campuses. In coordination with her principal, she oversees and coordinates the curriculum, behavior intervention, and mental health programs for this RTC. These campuses are focused on providing an educational model unlike any other, utilizing a blended learning model while prioritizing students' mental health. Ms. Hughes is currently in her second year at Baylor University working towards her PhD in educational leadership. Her dissertation is on exploring the resiliency of youth in care, particularly those in residential treatment facilities. Karanda Williams Cooper is a 16-year education veteran and believes in the power of servant leadership. Currently, she serves as area principal for the Brooksmith Independent School District. Her campuses exclusively serve students currently residing in residential treatment centers. Ms. Williams Cooper reshaped the blended program to address her students' academic and emotional issues by partnering with mental health professionals within the community. This program is the first of its kind by providing dedicated time within the student's schedule to meet with counselors during the week, or if needed, when the student is in crisis. Her goal is to make the blended program the norm within school districts to avert the school to prison pipeline. Thank you everyone for joining me. So, school to prison pipeline. I want to start there because I think that over the last several years, we have heard we've heard that statement a lot, right? And I actually think to a certain extent, it's a little bit watered down because it's something that we hear so often that we don't really know what it is and how it works. So I'm actually going to go to Dr. Franklin and ask him, explain to me in your words what the school to prison pipeline is.
So the school to prison pipeline, it suggests that if you enroll your child in school, you're preparing your child for prison. And don't think it's a middle school, intermediate, even an elementary school or a high school thing. Recent stats report that 47% of preschoolers are excluded from the classroom because of their behavior. That means that exclusionary discipline suggests that I'm going to take you out of the classroom because of your behavior. When you take me out of the classroom, you're disconnecting me from my ability to read, learn, and develop. The more you take me out, when I return to the classroom, I'm not developmentally capable of keeping up with other students. So as a child, how do I cope with that? How do I deal with that? I learned to be in the institution, but it's difficult for me to learn because as I grow in the institution, I am removed from the institution and I cannot compete with those peers around me. One is paying attention to my environmental and my other things that's going on in my life. So when I return, I am not inept to the things that are going on. So I act out like children do. And by the time they reach high school, then they are put in AEP programs, they're put in behavior programs so that when their identities develop, according to the Nigris model, they develop into this aggressive mentality in which they have poor self-worth, lacking identity, and they're trying to defend what they know, the institution.
So Ms. Hughes, I know that you work a lot in the school program and you talk to some of these kids who are consistently pulled out, who are labeled as troublemakers in the classroom. Tell me what you see on the flip side of that as the kids continue to go through grade school.
Well, pretty much what I'm seeing on the flip side is almost exactly what Dr. Franklin is seeing as well. These students are pulled out of the classroom. Many of them do have mental health issues such as ADHD, it could be depression, it could be the results of trauma. And because they're children, they don't know how to respond or react when things aren't going their way. And the school's response is to pull them out and put them into behavior programs. So you take all of these kids who have mental health issues and you stick them in a classroom with each other all day. They're not getting the real resources that they need, such as the mental health support, and they're feeding off of each other. And really, in a sense, they're incarcerated within the school system. And we see that not only in the public schools, but we see that in our residential treatment centers, where we work with those students who come into those centers. When they leave these facilities and when they leave these behavior programs, they have not developed the skills necessary to function appropriately in the real world. And really, it's like taking an incarcerated person and putting them out there. And what happens is they go back to their old habits, and then they may end up in jail instead of going forward and having a successful life as adults.
And Carol, as a parent advocate, as someone who's speaking on behalf of the parent and the children, are you seeing a lot of conditioning? I think we see a lot of parents who don't question. They don't question the discipline. They don't question the pullout. They don't question the classifications. How are you working to get parents in a space and place that they're starting to question how their boys are being treated? You're muted.
My apologies.
No
It's
worries.
about education and sharing the story, because when my son was first introduced into the school system, I relied a lot on what people told me, you know, whatever their professional opinion was, whatever their thoughts were, their philosophy. But then it became a time where, as a parent, I wanted to know for myself. I did research, I asked professionals, I stepped outside the box, I began to ask questions as opposed to just receiving the information. And that's the first start for parents. You know, you don't have to receive everything that's sent your direction. You know your child better than anyone. And once you begin to educate yourself and ask questions, then it causes the educator or the individual involved to begin to kind of rethink and step outside the box as well. And I think that's important as a parent in order to begin to challenge those things, because I will agree with the other panel members that, you know, my son continued to be pulled out. And, you know, I question, I mean, he began to change a little bit. And I felt like he was falling in with the other crowd.
Right.
And when I said, no, there's got to be a different way. There's got to be other strategies. I researched those strategies. I asked about them. We began to do something different. And guess what? My son responded differently. And he was able to turn things around and begin to kind of step out of that conditioning, right? And he began to emerge as the person that he was meant to be. And so that's what I would encourage parents to do, is to ask those questions, be a part of support groups, hear other people's stories, you know, research, whatever you can do, and then also be active in what they're planning for your child. Because again, I remember times they will just tell me, this is the best thing for your son. But be a part of that planning and what's going on with your child. So that way we can make sure that our children are conditioned appropriately.
Thank you. And, you know, just to piggyback off of that, I just last week had my IEP ARD meeting for my son. And, you know, he's immunocompromised, and his ARD committee is like, yeah, he just needs to be back in the school and that's going to fix everything. Well, you know, his issues started before the pandemic, and they're not going to be solved by him being back in the building. There's no cookie cutter way to approach this. But I want to go to Ms. Williams as a principal who is running a program and dealing with the parents and the children. I know one of the things that's a huge deficit for our community is our busyness, right? We're working class people. We have to be at jobs. Some of us are at 2 and 3 jobs. We have multiple children, and everything that happens in the school for the most part happens during business hours. So there's a lot of absenteeism that's not necessarily an absent parent. How do you combat that and make it an inclusionary environment for your parents?
Well, one of the ways that we do that is by making ourselves flexible to be able to meet that. So to be an administrator, to work with this type of group of students, you have to understand first and foremost that the parents have to be allowed to be given every opportunity to be a part of their child's plan. if you're going to make any type of headway, you have to be able to make that plan. And I want to go back to Ms. Hayes Buchanan. You are absolutely correct. You have to be able to be there and be that stand-in, be that advocate for your student. As an administrator, I try to empower the parents. I always walk in with what can we do to help you to be able to be sure. Now, the older the children get, we go to the children and we always start off in ARD, or we always start off if it's any type of discipline or even a good thing, what can we do to help you to continue to keep going, to be stronger as a student? But what can we do to help you to function in the classroom? And a lot of it all boils down to having that trust and building that. And so aggressively as an administrator, I try to really build that trust with the student as well with the parent, because a lot of times parents have trauma too. They've gone to the school previously in the past, they've asked for help and they haven't been able to get help. We call when the student is doing something bad, but we never call when something is going good. And so one of the things that I try to do is make sure that my teachers are contacting the parents when the students are doing good, because they also need to be celebrated that way. We need to change the culture of this us against them type of mentality. If you're a good kid and you sit over here and you're quiet, then you're doing good. You might not be learning, but you're good. And the parent thinks that everything is fine until they can't pass a test or they can't function in society. So it's kind of twofold, but the most important thing is making sure that we have a good relationship, a working relationship, and understanding, yes, mom might have to call us in on lunch break. And yes, the teacher may be teaching another class, but you get somebody to cover that class to accommodate the teacher, because the parent is the most important piece in the child's growth. So that's how we do that.
And I kind of want to piggyback on what Ms. Williams and Ms. Cooper Williams and Ms. Hayes Buchanan had stated. As a special educator and facilitating many arts, often we have minority parents that are not present, and it could be because of jobs or, they're holding down 2 and 3 jobs. We really encourage parents like Ms. Hayes Buchanan has done, and you, Ms. Alexander, to be that squeaky wheel, because that's how you get things done. You have to be a part of what's happening in the school system. You have to be there advocating for your students. You have to teach your students how to advocate for themselves and how to address the wrongs that's happening. Students, especially minority students, they are comfortable outside with their friends, but when you put them into an art meeting, an IEP meeting everywhere else in the country, there's 7 adults in the room, it's very intimidating for them. And they're afraid to speak up when this meeting is about them. So really working with your students to know how to advocate for themselves and not be intimidated by the 7 adults in the room, because this is about you. This is about your life. This is what you're going to be doing for the rest of your career, and telling us what's going to help you in the classroom. And I really want to encourage minority parents to do that, because I see that happening all of the time. And I know it's difficult for parents, for a lot of parents who are holding down many jobs, to be as present as you ladies have in the school system. And a lot of times, and like Ms. Cooper Williams said, you call them and they always think it's bad news and they don't pick up the phone and they don't want to respond. But try to find someone in the school that's an advocate for you, so that you can be in the loop of what's happening with your students and not hearing about it, a day or 2 after it's happened.
Mm-hmm.
So let me say this also, because I thought it would come up, but it didn't. So part of this conflict with Black students versus other students, because other students get in trouble as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
But the real issue is how our students, our Black males, respond.
Yes.
I'm definitely no different. There's a tiger in me. So here's what happens. So there's this thing called implicit and explicit bias.
Mm-hmm.
That when our children are put in a situation, because they put in these programs and they say, this is what's best for them. And technically that might be true if they had the support that they would give other people. And then they translate these kids in learning while they're out of the classroom and then put them back in the classroom. I know this because I am a specialist, I'm a psychotherapist, and oftentimes I'm either in these special programs like PASS, positive behavioral approach to successful education. So when these children are taken out, they don't expect you to be kind and loving and supportive to our Black children, because no one thinks that the parent's going to call. But
Right.
Dr. Franklin's very loving and kind. And the second, I was loving and kind and supportive to our Black students because their roar didn't shock me. So what happens is that the students, they receive even more disciplinary referrals while they're in these transferred programs, and they're pushed further and further back to other programs that exclude them from the program. So this implicit and explicit bias, there's this roar that comes out of Black males that doesn't come out of other students that people are intimidated by. And they don't have a professional approach to be able to come alongside and love these students and encourage them. I'm talking as professionals, that are able to push them back into the program, connect with the parents, and cause those parents to reconnect. Instead of calling me the whisperer for Black students, why don't all professionals learn to whisper to our students with love and encourage them to learn?
And I would even take it a step further and say, even for those non-Black students who do have a roar, they're treated differently.
They are.
Our students are not allowed to make mistakes. Our children are not allowed to be children, right? We have this expectancy that they will come out and know how to navigate a world. And if that were the case, then, we would be animals in the wild because they wouldn't need parenting. So I agree with everything you said, Dr. Franklin, but even in addition to that, our Black men and boys in particular are not giving the latitude to grow, to make mistakes, to have educational moments and still be accepted and loved and seen as children. So I think it's important to mention that as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the lack of culturally appropriate resources in education, in healthcare, and in the community, and how all of those things are combined and lend to the ability for students to get caught up into this, or children to get caught up in this school to prison pipeline. I'll start with you, Dr. Franklin.
Yeah, so this has been one of the things I've advocated for. And I advocated for a curriculum, either a check-in, a check-out system where I check in with the students before the program, before school, and check in after. And I've designed a curriculum to teach to self-empower, to restore, because in my opinion, it's Black identity. The school is tearing down our Black identity, not allowing us to be Black. So unless we take on a white identity, we're not approved, we're not accepted. Mm-hmm. So my thing was, let me teach this curriculum. But then I became a target and attacked and tried, and they came after me for that. And then the systems of research was shut down for me. So, but again, I think when you look at the programs that work all over this country, particularly there's been some sprouting programs in New York. When you look at the programs that work, it's because we allow them to roar. We're not intimidated by their response. And then we begin to put around them, teach them, educate them on who they are, because we lost so much with our dysphoria from Africa or from other places. And then we come into this country and we have no sense of identity other than sports and athleticism to relate to. So part of our work would be to restore them, to create cultural awareness of who they have been over the centuries and how great warriors we are. This is why you roar, but we channel that roar into something relevant, something positive, and something that benefits the whole culture.
One of the things too, piggybacking on what Dr. Franklin was saying about being isolated after bringing up these things, as parents, the most important voice you have is with the PTA, is that power within the school. You do have that power to go to the school board, and there's power in numbers. So as an educator, we say you don't want to rock the boat, you want to focus more on testing. But by doing that, you're trying to make this homogenous group of students when they're not. They have cultural differences. And the culture is that if we all are the same, then we don't need to discuss the differences. But there are biases. You know, even with my teachers of you know, of not color, you know, they said, well, he's being loud. Okay, well, can you define what loud is? You know, well, he is being distracting. How is he being distracting? And so, and really speaking truth to that, and that's changing the culture of the education system. And you only do that by one campus at a time, one district at a time. But the most powerful voice on campus is not the administrators. It's not even the school board. It's the parents, because you vote for the school board member. And if you want change, as we've seen time and time again, especially in this cultural, in this politically divisive country climate that we're in right now, it's your voice. And that is how we're going to get it changed. We're going to get it changed by educators advocating like Dr. Franklin and myself for change to get that in. But the most important voice are the parents. Please, if you don't take anything away, you have the power. You do not have to take what is being given to you, but there's power in numbers. Just like with your group is a beautiful idea because you now have these numbers in order to do that. So I would kind of put that challenge out there to you to kind of get some people together, get a committee together, and let's really start making a change and doing that.
So represented on this panel is a lot of different backgrounds, right? We have psychologists, we have therapists, we have parents, we have healthcare professionals. In this, and I'm a parent and I'm a healthcare professional, and I remember, I'll be completely transparent here. I remember when my son started therapy on his school campus, and his therapist asked me for permission to talk to his therapist outside of the school campus. And I said, no. You know, even with all of the knowledge that I have, I did not trust that my son would be okay with me giving authority for his therapist to look into other areas of his life. And I think that we should talk a little bit about that trust issue, because it would be most beneficial if the therapist on my son's school campus spoke to his therapist outside of the school campus and even had conversations with his doctors so that everyone is on the same page and things are not working against him. But we've seen time and time again where information has not always been power, it's also been a hindrance, and it's been hurtful for our children. So I'm going to go to Ms. Hughes. What do you think about that?
Well, you brought up a very an important point, is trust. And I see that time and time again in Texas, we call ourselves LSSPs, but school psychologists everywhere else. We find that parents, minority parents, particularly Black parents, do not trust the schools and do not trust the schools have their students' best interests at heart. And they come off as being difficult parents, but really when you get to know them and you start talking to them, you realize it's fear, it's mistrust, it's you haven't done well by my child all of these years, you haven't given me the confidence that you're going to do well by him in the future. And so those parents actually become a challenge for the schools. So when they call or when they try to come up to the schools, barriers are put in place, you know, they're talked about as like, oh, be careful with this parent because they're going to do so and so, they're going to say this. And really what it is, when you get down to the meat of it and to the heart of it, it's just that they're like every other parent in the school, but they're viewed differently. I care about my child. I'm worried about my child. I want to do and see what's best for him. But the way you're responding to me, not being transparent a lot of the times, you don't engender that trust in me. And so I'm having a really difficult time with this. So yes, you're right. I can see where it comes from because, you know, some schools, I'm not saying all of them, have not been completely transparent with parents as to what's happening with their students. And I wouldn't say that anybody has used information that they've gotten from outside doctors, because that would be very helpful when you're working within the school system to see what's going on with the student and how that's affecting his education. As you know, as school psychologists, we work with students to determine how their mental issues are affecting them academically. And yes, that information is very helpful, but if you feel like the schools have not been transparent with you or have not done well by your son, I could see why you're unwilling to do that. And I've had many parents, many Black moms in particular, that have had those issues. And they do come off as, you know, to the staff, to the teachers, to the principal, as problematic. These are our problem parents. You know, they try to avoid you. They try to not take your calls, send it to voicemail, say they'll respond, and it's weeks before you hear anything back from them. So I would say just keep up the pressure like you all have done. Keep talking to the principal, keep talking to the counselors, and don't let up until things turn around and change, and force them to be transparent with you.
Kimberly, can I speak to that?
Absolutely. Ms.
So-
Haynes Buchanan, and then I'll go to Dr. Franklin.
Okay. Well, what I was going to say is I was one of those parents. Every educator in my son's district was probably excited when he graduated because I was that parent. Literally, every teacher was like, man, do I have her child in my classroom? And I was okay with that because for me, you were going to be accountable. I was really big about accountability, and I was really big about you're going to be thoughtful about how you address my child. That was my standard. And I carried that standard consistently. And, you know, I heard the whispers in the background. I heard all that. I was a president of the PTA when my son was in middle school. And they were just shocked because they were like, oh, she's being nice to us. I don't have a problem with you guys. What I have a problem with is when you're not being thoughtful and considerate with my child, and when you're not being accountable for your actions.
Absolutely.
And then I took it a step further and I joined the school board, and I was a member of the school board for 3 years. That's how serious I was about making sure that educators were accountable and that they were, you know, utilizing every resource, every possible plan to make sure children were successful. And that was a passion that I had. So I want to just echo what Ms. Hughes was saying is, as parents, and also Ms. Cooper Williams, that we have a voice. And it's about how we choose to use that voice. I didn't go into the school cursing and fussing. I went into the school and was like, this is the standard. And this is the standard that I maintain. Whenever he got a new teacher, I was the one sending an email right before to say, hey, guess what? My son's in your class. I'm Carol Haynes Buchanan, and here's what I expect from you. When he has behavioral issues, I expect communication. And I laid my expectations out, and I did that faithfully all the way through high school. I went to every open house, every parent-teacher meeting. You know, even I had to participate via phone. I made sure that they understood and they felt my presence, whether I was with my child or not. And I think if every parent can find some degree of that presence for their child, it helps educators realize that they're accountable and they adjust their behavior accordingly.
Dr. Franklin, I'm going to go to you. I'm going to go to Dr. Franklin because he had a thought he wanted to share.
Yes. So I think part of what I hear Kimberly saying is that when people document on our children, what we say, they take it and they flip it, and it becomes other things, and they interpret the information differently. Why? Because they're not interpreting information from culture. And that puts us in a difficult position. Do I expose my child to this therapist who don't understand all that's going on? And then do I end up with a CPS case because of what they're hearing, they're not interpreting properly. So being on both sides of the issue, having to work for CPS for 5 years and then being able to be a therapist, what I see is that we have to find in advance our own therapists and make sure they know your child like I know your child and understand the dynamics of our culture. So when they ask you, can they see the school therapist? Well, he already has a therapist, and it becomes an ethical issue when they see that therapist and you already have a therapist. Now, the other thing is, it's bigger than just having a therapist. The other problem is that Black therapists Black therapists are constrained because of the systems we're under. We really need, and I'm praying God to teach me how to create our own clinical board for Black therapists so we can talk the way we need to talk to our children.
I want to go back to a point before we move on. I hear everyone on the panel when you say parents need to be involved, the PTA, the school board, but I can't not echo the community and the environment that we live in. And I don't want parents to come off of this call feeling chastised by their inability to be present all the time. You know, it is extremely difficult. And I know some of the services that we help parents with in Mob United is learning how to navigate those systems, even amongst the community, physical, and the responsibility that they have at home and as parents. And I just want to make it clear that we are not saying we don't understand what your plight is, because there are many of us who have lots to do and are working multiple jobs, and it's not necessarily always just feasible for you to be present. And I want to acknowledge that part of it as well. So we know that kids get therapy in school, and I know for my son, he gets therapy 3 times every 9 weeks with his school psychologist. And he is not this kid that forges relationships and builds a rapport very quickly. It takes some time. How do you guys see that as detrimental to the progress in school?
It can be extremely difficult because you have to build that relationship and you have to build that rapport with the student. But that entails building that rapport with the parent, because then that student's going to trust you more because you have that relationship with his parents as well. And I know a lot of schools don't do that. And that goes a long way to helping the student be more responsive to therapy. Okay. And there are times when maybe therapy is not necessarily the answer for that student, but just having someone to talk to help get things off their things that they will not want to talk to parents about. But they need to have a safe place, that safe person, a safe advocate within the school setting where they feel they can go and speak to that person. And so even if the therapist is not the one that's doing it, find somebody in the school that's doing, and I've done that with many students, like, I don't want to go talk to the counselors, I don't like any of them, but we had a behavior specialist that student really bonded with. And so, okay, let's build that relationship with that behavior specialist. Or maybe there's a teacher that they really bonded with. So maybe that's the person that they can speak to. Or even we had an SRO, he was fantastic and the kids loved him and they would go and spend their lunch with him and talk to him. So if you have that person that they feel is a safe person for them within the school setting, sometimes that's even better than therapy. But as therapists, we need to step out more and build those relationships with parents so that we can build those relationships with the students. And I feel like that needs to happen with everyone. And going back to your point about, and I understand there are parents that have 2 and 3 jobs that are not able to be a part of the school system as they would like to be, but find times outside of the school day, perhaps find that person that you can reach out to and speak with so that they understand what's going on with you and have that communication going. And it's important for kids to know that you as a parent have those advocates within the school system, because that gives them some checks and balances as well. Because we know all our kids are wonderful, but sometimes they will hook up with kids in the school system that are not the best for them to be, friends with or have, interactions with. And having that communication between the parents and someone in the school system can help mitigate that.
And I think Dr. Franklin is busting at the seams here.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I definitely echo Ms. Hughes on that, because for me, when I couldn't be there, I found someone after school who I felt like represented me on behalf of my child when I couldn't be there. And I think that's very important because this individual actually built a relationship with me. I trusted this individual. She actually happens to be on this call, but when I couldn't be there to address my son's needs, I was like, maybe I had to work or I had to do a meeting. I would let her address it on my behalf, and I would call her after hours. And because she was like, hey, call me at 6, call me when you get a chance, I'll update you. and brief you on, what happened and what the next steps are. And so I definitely feel like, when you build that trust with an individual, whether it's a therapist or a teacher on the campus, I think that's important because they can kind of represent you while you're absentee, right? And still make sure that your child was properly handled or addressed while at school. And so that works. I'm actually a witness of that. And I'm thankful for that support as a parent. So to all the educators out there too, those kinds of support, especially for parents who are busy and are not able to be present, is so important. So like Ms. Hughes said, reach out, build that relationship and those connections.
And I also want to kind of jump in real quick. Before I became an educator, I worked full time. I went to school full time. I had two full-time boys. Both of them were special education. Both of them were what they labeled as emotionally disturbed, behavior problems. Both of them have been through PASS. And that's a behavior program we have here in Texas. So as a parent, I wasn't able to always be there because I had to be in class, or I was on the road to class, or I was on my way to go and sell somebody some insurance so I could, take care of the home. But one of the things I did do is I built a network around me. And ironically, it was my son's babysitter, Miss Doris. It was my best friend who was there. I have two best friends. And so there were people who were like the wind beneath my wings. If you know somebody who is like that, that's in your life, that takes an active role, you may not be able to be there, but that person knows what your desires are for your child. They also know that child because they spend time with that child and they know them. So if they're willing to do that, also activate that, because there are going to be some things that you have to handle during school time and you might not be able to do it. So again, and that's really true, Ms. Kimberly, we don't want you to walk away and feel like, well, I don't have time to do that. How am I ever going to do that? That's just one of the ways that I did that. And as an educator and as an administrator, I'm very cognizant of that. Yes, you may see grandmother all the time, but that's probably because mother and father are off doing something else. And that's the person when they get back together. Also to having people, like Ms. Hayes Buchanan said, having people that can contact you from the school in the afternoon time, that's also great. But if you can't, there's a question that came across on the chat. Can we answer it now? Can I answer it now, or?
Let's finish the discussion and then we'll answer the questions at the end.
Dr. Franklin is just bursting.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Franklin.
So I am a single father of two awesome children. And one of the things that I put in place, because I'm everywhere but nowhere, I want to know everything that somebody writes about my child.
Okay.
And when I have documents in front of me, I pull out this ink pen and I mark and I strike it up, take it back to the school and say, you need to correct this because this is misinterpreted and it wasn't understood in the context in which it was given. We have to do more reading because there's a silent narrative about your child that comes out of what's being written about your child. So then they say, oh, you know what? His mom and his dad are not together, and he's struggling. So he's going to be a bit. And when information comes out like that and it's spoken, then you need to be able to see what people are putting in print, which helps you to understand how they are perceiving yourself as parents and how they're perceiving your children. So, I mean, if we always can't be present, because when we're present, I think people expect a loud thing with us. But I think my writing is a lot louder than my aggression. And people can write for you. So don't be afraid to send a letter, but first, before you send a letter, see what's been written, and you have the access to anything written by your child. I think I've said enough.
Okay, so I think that's a good segue to the criminalization of education. Over the years, we've seen how education has transitioned to this place. I think someone said earlier, it's like your child is incarcerated while in school. We have now school resource officers who are PD. They're from the police department, they carry weapons, and we see at astronomical numbers of Black boys whose behavior is criminalized. I'll start with Ms. Williams on that.
Yes, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about that, and I'm going back to how I built, how I went in and I pretty much changed how that resource officer looked and felt in my school. And that was a culture thing. You know, I do not need you to come and remove a student because they don't want to sharpen their pencil, or they do want to sharpen their pencil, or they don't have, you know, that's not the way that we should be using them. You know, I did not want them armed on campus because we're not in a prison. I have worked in the prison system in juvenile justice and seeing that it does something to our children. And as an educator, I have to say that, you know, if we really want to stop the school to prison pipeline, you know, it starts with the school because we're setting them up. You know, you cannot penalize. And I think Dr. Franklin said that earlier on. When you take a child out of class and you allow your child to be taken out of class repeatedly for in-school suspension, well, they have this guise of being in school. There's no learning going on. You have now told that child that whatever your crime was, that you are not fit to be with society. And there's nothing that a child could do in school that would justify for them to be removed completely. So again, it goes back, and I keep saying it, and I guess this is my mantra, it goes back to having that culture shift. And it has to be a culture shift. And it's not just me, but it has to be the parents. It has to be the community, because there's people who are outside who went through that system and know that it's not fair. And, you know, changing those rules, you know, when I look at it and I say, okay, how many times has this child come to my office? Why is this child coming to my office? Why is what we call a frequent flyer? Why do I have this frequent flyer? So now I need to have a conversation with the child. Now I need to have a conversation with the parent, not because the parent is in trouble, because the kid is in trouble, but what can we do in order to help this child stay in class? What can we do to work within the system? On the opposite side, every year administrators go through, we look at the discipline matrix. And that's one of the things that every parent should know, should have on tap, should see, have it taped to wherever it is that you frequently look at, because that's the way that children are supposed to be disciplined if there's something that comes to discipline in the classroom or in the school. A lot of times our children, especially our boys of color, they don't have that luxury. It's like we're going from here to here, boom, and that's it. There's no discussion. So again, it comes with that partnership with the parents, but also having a progressive leadership that understands that, hey, we need to meet the need of every child. And if this child is acting out, it may be that maybe he's been undiagnosed and not been able to be able to read. That's where partnership, working with health professionals, working with your DIAG and your testing. And just because a kid's been tested one time doesn't mean that he can't be tested again. There may be something else that's going on that we don't know. So, I mean, there's so many factors that play into it, but the most important thing is being able to be fair, firm, and consistent. And as an administrator, that's what you have to do. And as a parent, you have to hold that school to being fair, firm, and consistent. You might not be able to speak for every child, but you can speak for your child. And you have to be able to do that, because if not, we have to shine a light on what's going on. And sitting here on this panel, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, you know, I think I'm the odd man out, because I am an administrator, and frequently I get the other side of the desk where I'm here and I have to uphold what the district is telling me to do. And a lot of times I tell them, you know, ma'am, there's a process. You don't like my decision, and you need to know there's a process. There's another person that you can go to. And if you got to take it all the way to the school board, then you do it. You do what's right for your child. And just because the district is telling me this is what you have to do, this is how we're going to play it, I have to stick to it. But as a parent, I've got to tell you, you can say, okay, let's move to the next one. Let's start this, because I'm not going to have my child being put out of school. Most recently here in Texas, the most ridiculous one was about a child's dreadlocks. That's his culture. but we want to victimize the culture. We say it's the distracting hairstyle. Well, I see somebody come to school with pink, purple, blue, and green. I think that's distracting too. But they're still in class. But I'm told that when you have hair designs in your head, who is that targeted towards?
Right.
So again, when they're making these decisions and they put those things out there, you need to be able to say, and you need to put a light and shine a light and say, no, not my child, not my group, not today.
So I want to talk a little bit about evaluations in school. I know it took me some time to realize that the evaluations that happened in school were different than evaluations that allowed my child to access community. And so evaluations that happen in school and are part of the IEP ARD committee are designed to mitigate how your child accesses education. And that doesn't necessarily translate to what happens at home or what resources are available to my children in the community. So I'm gonna ask that Ms. Hughes talked a little bit about that, and then Ms. Haynes Buchanan follow that up as a parent.
Okay, so evaluations in school, and somebody had brought up the word ED. Disproportionately, Black boys are diagnosed as ED because their behaviors are considered aggressive and not the norm. And nobody is looking really at the culture, the environment of what's going on with the student. And they have to meet 5 criteria. And if they meet one of those criteria, they'll be categorized as emotionally disturbed. Secondly, disproportionately, Black boys are labeled as intellectually disabled or have some sort of learning disability. And so that continues to widen the gap between minorities, marginalized students, and other students in the school setting. And so they're overrepresented in special education. They're overrepresented as students with emotional disturbances. So that is something we need to really address as school psychologists and as evaluators, that we have to take into consideration that looking at the culture, looking at the environment. That ED label for me is such a heavy label, and that follows you, even though special education is supposed to be to help your child level the playing field. It's not supposed to be a life sentence. Many times when kids get evaluated and they qualify for special educations, they're in their entire school career, even though they've made progress. So a lot of times that holds students back instead of lifting them up. And I have very rare occasions where I've actually dismissed a child from special education. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area around the country, not just in Texas. Really how we evaluate. We need to have evaluators, LSSB, school psychologists who are well-versed in culture to understand that this is not necessarily an emotional disturbance or emotional distress. This could be that child's environment. I remember having some parents, a student that was considered emotionally distressed in a high school that I worked, and she spoke very loudly, but she was a survivor. Her mom was in and out of prison. There's so much going on at home. It could be just, she's trying to take care of herself as a young woman. And when her family did come into the school to have a conversation with me, and it was rare that I was able to speak to them, they all spoke very loudly. I remember my administrator come running down to my office asking me if I needed help because they didn't understand the culture and the environment I'm like, no, I don't need help. I'm just having a conversation. And so they were like, oh, but it was so loud. We just thought maybe you needed help in here. I'm like, no. So culturally relevant pedagogy, getting parents, getting schools, administrators, and people who are not of color to understand the culture with which they're dealing is imperative. And we really have to look at all the ED diagnoses we do with Black boys, because that is such a heavy label and that follows them. And that is another contributor to that school to prison pipeline when you think about it, because those boys inadvertently get sent to behavior programs, which they never get out of. They start that elementary, they go into middle school, and they end up in high school, and there's still behavior issues within the school system.
Ms. Haynes Buchanan?
I definitely agree that it is like two separate systems, right? The community and school, because all of your school records, they really are speak to the school setting and how that child functions and, you know, their IQ levels and all that good stuff. And I have a child that went to the secondary, post-secondary in college. And the first thing that the disability service program wanted to see was all the school records for the, you know, to see what accommodations were done and those kinds of things. When it came to the community supports, I found those through connecting with support groups or my, you know, my private health insurance, different, you know, referrals there, or talking to the pediatrician. And that's how I found the community supports because, outside of school, your child has to function with other people and learn how to, you know, merge into society. And school doesn't teach everything. So a lot of times you do have that dual support where you have your school activities and then you'll have what, you know, maybe outside therapist or outside, support group or whatever the case is, activities. For building things. And so you kind of have that dual approach for your children.
Mhm.
And I think that's important. And then when you get to the college level for children that are able to go on to that level, they look at a combination of that support, those records, but they look primarily at the school pieces of it.
Mhm.
So just wanted to make that distinction about you do have to kind of get support on both levels. And then sometimes the schools can also give you referrals to the community pieces of that support. I also wanted to mention that, and I might be, just going over the edge here, but along with that diagnosis that they give, they also provide sometimes that medication that comes with it.
Mhm.
And you got to be mindful as a parent about that medication part. Because I'm not a big fan of controlled substances for our children, and I'm more of an advocate of maybe a non-stimulant with some behavioral programs associated with that, because research has shown that those controlled substances that we give our children young leads to a higher percentage or likelihood of having drug addictions and other things as your child develops. And so just those kinds of things that diagnosis, those records that they're providing, and that leads to those medication, those health choices.
Mhm.
As parents, we got to be aware of that as well.
And
Dr. Franklin, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Hughes.
I just want to say one more thing that Ms. Buchanan was talking about. And I was thinking about a program called Communities in Schools. And not every school has that,
Mhm.
but some schools do. And I know that when I was in one of my earlier districts, I reached out to our local mental health and mental retardation community. And so they brought a bunch of resources together and we had parent meetings, letting parents know what's out there, what services that they can sign up for. So really reach out to your LSSPs in Texas and school psychologists in other states, and they should have that information about what community services that are available to you. And I know one of the other services that we use, especially with our students in special needs, is the Texas Workforce Commission. And many times when I have students in special education, we would call in once they get to that age of transition, have a meeting with Texas Workforce Commission and do an intake, and they can partner with the parent. And so those meetings are held. We like to have them within the IEPR meetings, but of course, with parents' time, we set up meetings with them outside of the school setting, and they could see what services are available once they get out of high school. They help them with summer earn and learn programs. They help them with PALS programs, teaching them how to fill out resumes and what have you. And they help them with mental health services as well. I wish we had more within the school setting that we can do. Some schools do have a lot of resources, but not many do. And so just reach out to the school psychologists at LSSP in Texas, and they can help you with that. And I know Dr. Franklin has some stuff to say, especially with the medication. I can see him over there.
Before he goes on to the Texas Workforce Commission has been great for my daughter who isn't in post-secondary education. So I can speak to the services that they have there. Dr. Franklin, last year when we did our mental health program, we spoke with a psychiatrist and she said something that was profound for me. She said, the Black community is the only community that continuously experiences trauma, yet is asked to achieve. And we've done so, right? Many of our Black men and women have continuously achieved despite the trauma that we've experienced. Tell us about how you see the manifestations of PTSD, depression, and anxiety on our physical and on how we navigate the community.
Sure, very good point. When we think of post-traumatic stress disorder, we tend to think that it's a military thing,
Mm-hmm.
or we think maybe it's associated with sexual trauma.
Mm-hmm.
However, post-traumatic stress disorder is very profound in our community, and it's been mistaken for bipolar 1, bipolar 2, or manic depression. Let me loop this statement in there while I deal with this. One of the panelists had suggested that they get on medication and they end up using drugs. They end up using drugs often because they stop taking medication. So they self-medicate by taking drugs. And believe it or not, that they start losing services at 18, and they, as an adult, they don't know how to advocate for themselves and continue the services to be able to obtain medication to keep them stable. Anyway, that's another piece that I like to deal with. But PTSD for children is first seen in the lives of parents. The trauma that parents are going through on a day-to-day basis, how we're being all targeted and being mistreated. Our children see that and they suffer with this sense of hopelessness. And then the uncertainty of finances and life, and the uncertainty, they look around and they see in the communities these things that other people are receiving, and then they show up at school. Then they have to suffer their experience, their community, and trauma works in this way. If it's either a child is able to answer the questions, work through the questions that go on in the brain, that happens in the body, and then that child is able to heal and make the best of it and learn from that experience. If the child is not able to cognitively understand the world around them, the child is not able to interpret what's happening to mom and dad, and while they feel like they are invisible, then the child suppresses these feelings and try to normalize. The more they try to suppress these feelings and try to normalize, then later in life, they start to have explosive behavior because the body wants to reconcile what's not understood within the self. That's generally how PTSD works. And then we start to self-soothe. And as older adults, when we're still suffering from trauma, we self-soothe by eating. So we get signs of putting on weight, which then terminalizes into some form of depression. PTSD is often forms of anxiety, depression that's mixed. And you either go from one extreme to anxiety, where you're anxious, nervous, worried about being accepted, or you go to the depressive side, to where you have no sense of self and no sense of hope. Why should I go to school? Why should I accomplish? And these are patterns picked up in the household, in the environment, because of the struggle that we as African Americans have to deal with on a daily basis, being able to navigate life. And most of our struggle is because we don't become a part of the community, our own community, because we're so divided among ourselves. So as we learn to try to bond together yet again, and the point was we used to do this through the church, but that's no longer a thing where we come to bond as community. So our biggest first issue is being able to bond together, because the community can help to heal trauma. Mm-hmm. And when I was growing up, there were different type of African culture groups for children and for parents, so we can understand who we are as people and how we bond together and how we heal one another. Southern University has a library of how even during the slaves, their narratives, they would cut an area in the middle of a field and they would have what they call a clearing, and they would come out and testify of abuses that happened in their slave quarters. We don't have a clearing anymore. We haven't advocated for one where we can go and put our crime and our sins and our things we've suffered. But thank God for MOB, because this has become a type of community in which people can bear their sufferings But the more we bond together, it helps to minimize our trauma. Our body wants answers to the things that we're suffering, that we're going through.
All
And
right.
can I add to what Dr. Franklin is saying? Because
Absolutely.
trauma, and it doesn't have to be repeated incidences of trauma. It could be the single incident that can have an effect on a child. And that effect is seen in their ability to read, in their ability to respond appropriately, in their motivation. And so that is what's manifested in the school setting. And then we look at them as behavior issues and yes, they may have emotional stress because of the trauma, but we have to understand what the function of that behavior is and what's happening behind the scenes. And we're talking about students with autism, and especially in girls, and this is a subject for a whole other day, but a lot of times girls are misdiagnosed as being bipolar when they're actually on the autism spectrum. And I know there's limited research on that because girls, present so different than boys. But going back to trauma in the school setting, what we see is the acting out behaviors, the lack of motivation, the ability to not diminished cognitive abilities. And we have to be very cognizant of that in the school setting and work with these students in that way. And with our RTC schools, of course, these kids, all of them have suffered trauma, and we see all of those behaviors and we see all of that acting out. And we have to work with our teachers and train them to understand that when these kids act out, it's not personal. Don't take it personally. This is a response to the trauma that they have experienced in their lives.
Yes.
So what I do is I create a clearing at school. I'm not going to say what school, but we had an incident where we had a straight A student who done well, African-American female, did great. But she was put in a situation where she had suffered some sexual trauma. Parent continued to report it. And what should have happened is that she should have been brought into SPED. And there should have been some sensitivity to the things she's been through. One of the things about being a part of, the good news about being a part of SPED, special education, and or diagnosis ED, emotionally disturbed, is that because of that, the school can't put you out if what you're going through is a result of what you've been diagnosed with. But parents don't advocate that, so the children end up being put out. However, in this instance, because all these things happened, the school ignored this young student. I created a clearing with the student. And believe it or not, a clearing is nothing more than giving the child space to hear their story without correcting them and being controlling in that dynamic, but being able to hear them out and help them to navigate their narrative as they see things. And as they begin to flesh things out, then they've established a trust, a rapport with you, and then you can go back and look at some of those dynamics and see if you can reconcile those things that's been shared with you. And by the time this took 2 months for me to follow and be with this person, but this student recovered, did extremely well, and was placed back into a normal setting. So it's very important that we learn to create clearing for our own children if no one else is doing it for us.
Last question before we start to take, I'm sorry, Ms. Hughes.
I was just going to say, I hate the word normal. I want to say typical, because normal to me suggests that a student going through trauma is abnormal. So I would like a typical setting.
Last question before we start taking questions from the community. I want to allow enough time for that and be respectful of everyone's time. Children have the ability to refuse therapy. I experienced this as a parent. At the time I was living in Pennsylvania, not here in Texas, but I took my daughter, who ultimately ended up being diagnosed with bipolar and freely talks about that. And so I'm not sharing secrets here. And was told at the age of 14 that I needed to get her permission to provide an intervention to what she was experiencing. That was really difficult for me. One, because I'm that parent, first and foremost. Secondly, you're asking me to help my child and then telling me I have to get the permission of my child who is impaired in some way to do so. I also know that in some states, at a certain age, parents are restricted from online portals for health information, from talking to doctors, and made to leave rooms during examinations. How do we mitigate the things that our children need when society is telling us they can act as adults?
Act as adults as far as mental health, or, and if you have a student, okay, so going back to my special education world, I do encourage parents, if you have a child that's in special education, that you get guardianship. And I know the state of Texas does not like 100% guardianship because that takes away that child's right to vote. But you can get partial guardianship over their ability to make medical decisions or banking or any area that you feel that your child is not capable of handling. I don't believe in Texas that at 14 that a child has the right to make those type of decisions. Now, when they become 17 in the state of Texas, outside of the school setting, they're considered an adult. Within the school setting, they're still a child until they're 18. So I can't speak to other states, but Texas is pretty friendly to what parents in those incidences. So.
Right. Dr. Franklin, do you have anything to add there?
Well, I mean, advocacy, whether you do legal, like Mrs. Hughes is saying, building support with the child is really important. And if you put a community around that child, then that child might allow a bond with someone else. Because children, they can become impulsive and they can make these decisions on their own. If that child is attached to any type of is receiving SSI, SSI will allow a parent to be an advocate even past 21, 22, 23.
Okay.
So depending on what agency, because, if a child's trying to advocate, the child may have some funds that's coming their way to where they can kind of do what they want to do. So being able to connect through some of those other agencies will allow the parent to continue to manage control and or bringing in community members at the child attendance church. That's why it's good to get them planted into different programs in our community so that if they're not willing to hear you, maybe they'll allow someone else to help advocate through you.
I know for parents with children on the autism spectrum, there's a parent-to-parent network, but I think that is for all students that are in special education as well. So reach out to those parent networks and somebody within that network will be able to help you find those resources.
Okay. All right. So at this point, we're going to bring Defusing back on and she's going to help facilitate for questions.
Well, first of all, I just have to say thank you to all of you. This has been a wonderful conversation and so many great nuggets of information throughout. So I really appreciate you all just opening up and sharing your time and insights. So I'm going to start with a question. You all talked a lot about, the need to be engaged parents in challenging and questioning and being present and, mindful of how your children are being treated by teachers and administrators, what's being written about them. And I just wanted to get a little more your perspective on how do you balance being that vigilant, challenging parent. Even one of you, said that you were that parent with being, kind and supportive and trusting of your children's teachers in particular and, acknowledging their expertise. And I would say, particularly as Kim said, many parents don't have the ability to be super involved in the school and always up to school hosting fundraisers and PTA meetings and all of that. So for the parent who can't, be there in physical, tangible ways all the time, how would you suggest balancing that? I would like to hear from a few of you on that.
Well, I know a lot.
So I guess I'll launch out there first. So when you can't be super present, you can still be present, right? Not physically, but you can still lend a voice. And so in 2021, we have emails where you can send those communications. There's been times that I would just email a teacher and say, here's what I'm seeing, here are my thoughts, what are your thoughts? Now we can do Zoom and different things like that when we actually can't be on site. Also, we talked about earlier, finding that that educator, that teacher, that counselor who you can connect with and build that relationship with and they can be your after hours connection about what's going on with your child. And then you balance that with being positive. So in all of my questioning, I was always very respectful. It was like, what are your thoughts? And have you thought about these types of things? And then also recognizing when they do something great, right? When they implemented different programs and stuff for my son that I thought was awesome or worked really well, had great outcomes, it's also acknowledging that, right? Thank you so much for your great recommendation. And that's kind of how you balance. You recognize what's not working, but you also recognize what is working. And then you do more of a partnership. So those conversations, even in the moment of challenge, is still one of collaboration, right? Here's what I'm thinking. What are you thinking? And then how do we meet in the middle? And I think if you have that type of balance and it's not so adversarial or it's not so contentious between parents and educators. And then also too, you can do art meetings and things like that via phone and different things like that. So it's being creative with your child's, your team about what's the best way to communicate when you're able to be there and then when you're not able to be there. And as long as you guys have that mutual understanding and they understand your perspective and where you're coming from, I think that works as well.
And coming from the educator administrator side of things, we have to also meet the parents halfway. And I know that some parents can be scary and everybody wants to run and hide. But I believe that for all the educators out there, being transparent, because we're not doing anything that's going to hurt the child within the school setting. So there's no reason not to be totally transparent with a parent. I am available to parents, even as a SPED director, and I'm not directly working with the students, but I have parents that call me or email me or text me, and I will respond to them because I look at it as, as scary as this parent may seem to other people, again, at the core of their being is I want to do what is best for my child. And sometimes, and a lot of times when parents are angry, and I've found this to be common among all of the parents that have been difficult for the school setting, they feel that they're not being communicated to. They feel like they're being left out of the loop and they just want to be heard. And so we as educators need to give them that ability to speak, to share and say what's going on and let them know that they're being listened to and that we're hearing what they have to say. And even if our responses are not exactly what they want or believe, we need to educate them as well. So we have our role in this as well as the parents have their role. And I appreciate what Carol said about think about the tone and the way you approach the administrators as well, because that would go a long way. If you come in a spirit of cooperation, then we can get much further together.
Yeah, and I think that's especially true when you're communicating via email because so much can get lost. People don't know your tone, it can be misinterpreted. So I always try to start with something very happy and positive and end with thanks with an exclamation point or something. Because I find, especially with us, like it's assumed to be a negative tone. I want to go back to something that Kim mentioned earlier on in the call. She shared a personal experience about her school asking to connect with her child's private therapist and her saying no. And we never talked about this, but I had a similar experience where I also said no. And I wanted to get you all's reaction to how you should approach that. Because I did feel like they thought I was being difficult or resistant. But part of it was I had promised my child that this would be a safe space and that he didn't have to talk to anybody about it. I mean, the therapist doesn't even tell me what they talk about unless something is alarming, right? So it's private. That's one thing. And I certainly was not going to ask her to talk to a school psychologist about the contents of their conversations. One, because the issues they were talking about were not about school. And also because it was supposed to be a private, safe space. But the second part was I just didn't trust it. I didn't know how this information would be used. I thought it might be misinterpreted. So I just, particularly for those of you who work in the education system or with it, like, how do you think parents should navigate those type of requests?
Well, it's certainly up to the parents if they want to share that information or not. as from the school psychology perspective, I do like to look at outside reports because it helps me balance my report and it helps me make recommendations to the teachers. I don't share that with teachers or administrators, but it does give me insight and how I could advise administrators and teachers how to work with the student. But again, that's a matter of trust. I don't think you necessarily need it, but it does help me when I'm writing up a psych eval for in the school setting.
Anyone else? Well, I'll say what I said is, I'm talking to the therapist and I will summarize for you if there's anything that I think is relevant to the school environment. Like this has nothing to do with school. So I'll tell you, like, this is not, this is a school, an educational institution, not a psych ward. So I will share anything that I think connects to the school experience. As the parent, I feel that that's my job to do that, not for you to talk to other providers. So that was my response.
So,
Dr. Franklin, what were you going to say?
well, again, let me say that I think it's a great idea to have your own therapist outside of the school system so that if the school wants to direct something to a school within the school system, you as a parent can say, well, if you give me the issue, I'll have the therapist address this with them. And as a parent, you can talk with the therapist and talk about what you reviewed and even review some notes for children that are under 16 or 17, I believe. But when it comes to the school environment, I'm not saying I don't trust that environment. I'm just saying that the relationship that you have with maybe an outside therapist, if you choose right, it's just my opinion, it may advocate more for the family.
And it could be vice versa. Like I have offered to share my psych evals with the outside therapist because yes, her issue is outside, but it's affecting her as a person. And that could have some effect in what's happening within the school setting. So if you're not comfortable with the outside therapist sharing, and they don't have to share everything with the school psychologist,
Yeah.
we are happy to share what we have come up with our results with the outside therapist so that maybe he can see, in the school setting, this is what's happening, and maybe work with her in that setting outside of the school. So it can go either way. It doesn't necessarily have to be, and of course that's your prerogative. It doesn't have to be us getting the report from them. And I know with my students in the residential treatment centers, they all have psych evals when they come in. And I do look at those when I'm working on mine, and I use that as part of my report so I can make the best recommendation for that student. It may help me figure out what their triggers are and how to direct our team on how to work with a student, like, don't do these certain things because this may cause a triggering effect within this, with this child.
For me, it amounts to how well does a therapist write about your child? And when it's written, did they nail it when it comes to being able to explain your child's experience so that when that document's passed on, is it interpreted properly by anyone that reads it?
And that's probably what it was. I had a bad experience with that before this. And I was like, I don't trust your analysis. So I'm not interested in you connecting with this person. That's probably what it was.
Definitely.
And I would go over the report with the parent outside of the art meeting because you don't want to hear this information for the first time. It's sitting in a room with 6 other people. And so I would sit with the parent outside of the art meeting and we would go over the report in detail because I can take my time and ensure that you understand what's happening and what's going on. And you can say, look, I really don't want, and there are things that you don't want to put in the report because other people will be reading it. And it may not be relevant to what's happening within the school setting, or it may be information that you really shouldn't be sharing with everyone. And so I do sit with parents outside of the art meeting and go over those reports with them. And I would request that in case you have a meeting, say, I would like to go over that report with you before we go into an art IEP meeting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, we're short on time, so I'm going to ask another question. I'm going to try to combine 2 questions into one. But the overarching theme is, how do you assuming you have a choice, how do you find the right school environment for your child? And how do you know that the environment itself is causing harm to their mental health and you should just change schools? And I'll just share something. I was on a mental health forum with another organization earlier this week, and the psychologist who spoke, psychiatrist, a Black male psychiatrist spoke, and he said something that I thought was very profound, which is, many of the people on the call have their kids in private schools or predominantly white settings, in a pursuit of a better academic, achievement potential, and assuming that that's better. And he said that from his professional opinion and all he's seen with his patients, that he would prioritize making sure your child is in an environment that is affirming of them and that lifts them up over everything, like over, superior academic potential or reputation of the school. And, I would just love to hear you all's perspective on that overall. Like, how would you think about finding the right school environment for your child, and how do you know when it's not the right one?
So I think the psychologist was speaking to my area is Black identity. I mean, affirming the person, assuming that the child has a sense of who they are, their identity, their culture, affirming that causes the child to live within their own skin and not have to take on cultural vices or, another identity that causes them to have to split, how we do the switching. So I think that's really, really, really important, trying to find a place that says, hey, we are of many cultures, but there are people here that affirm the culture in which a child has been cultivated.
I have to say that's difficult to find because a lot of private schools, some charter schools, not all of them, I know there are charters that really reach out to the minority population to work with those students. That's a very difficult thing to find, especially when you have many low-income families who cannot afford a private school or to have the means to get to a charter school. Like in my community, I live in what's called a charter desert. So our only option for the students in our community is our local public schools. And in many cases, that has not been the best environment for our students. And in fact, yesterday I testified at the Senate for school choice and school vouchers. So my low-income families who want to find a different way or to have their children educated can have the means to do that. And I'm not saying that's just for white families, but I think that should be for minority families as well, because right now there is a barrier to low income, moms, Black families, to getting to those resources that are better suited for their children. That it's a huge problem. And I feel like, yeah, there are some schools I have worked in charter schools where our kids were not affirmed. And what was affirmed was the higher income families. What was affirmed was the high academic achievement. Not that our kids shouldn't be achieving high as well, but wanting to move their kids on to possibly Ivy League colleges. And if our students came in and they weren't performing at that level, they were looked at as if they were special needs. And I would repeatedly say, if they were in a regular public school, they would be an average student. So I would like to see more schools pop up out there, private, charter, what have you, that works with our students and understands the culture and the environment and the needs of our students. But we also have to make it where our families, low income, Black families, not all Black families are low income, but make it reachable for the Black community. And encouraging parents to go that way as well. A lot of them say they don't want to use it because of athletics. And we need to change the mindset that not every kid is going to play basketball or football. And, you have to find what's the best affirming culture environment for your child.
And I will say one of the things that a parent needs to look for, I know I read the question and they were saying, how do I know when to pull my student out? Definitely, especially for our Black boys, we want to be in a place where, we're affirming them, whether it's athletics, whether it's academic, or, it might be musically inclined, all of these different things. So the first thing that I would say that parent needs to look for is there a place that my child can have his or her own space? That's the first thing. The second thing is, is my child still excited about school? Where my child was excited before, is my child excited about school now? Listen to your child. If your child is telling you that, something is not right, this doesn't fit for me, I know it may be convenient for you, for all of the different, environmental things that we've said before, but those are some of the things that I would tell parents to look for. Making sure that you have a good line of connection or connection with someone in that school that works with your child. Making sure that the administrators are being responsive and listening to you. It's very important to be listened to. But if you're not being listened to, then it's not going to be a good environment, and it's going to set up that adversarial type of relationship, and you don't want that. So if you see that that's the type of environment that your child is in, and they're going to absorb that, and they're going to take that back into the classroom, they're going to take it with the teachers. So I would say to that parent that asked that question, that definitely make sure that you are in an environment, and your child is in an environment where they feel safe, that they're in an environment where you feel that they are getting the most out of it. Because it doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's just what I would say, because I know I read that and it made me think, because I personally had to take my child out of a school. I moved to a place where my child would be able to get an education. It was a blue ribbon school, and they didn't accept anybody from outside of their boundaries. So I moved to those boundaries. I paid the higher rent, cut back on different things, cut back on the car note so they could have that. But in the end, they were really harming him. And, he became this child that I didn't even recognize anymore. Every day they were calling me. They were saying he was doing this, he was doing that. And in the end, he said, the people there don't like me. And so I, as a parent, had to get up and say, okay, let me find another place for my kid to go. And when I did, he flourished. So as a parent, that is a hard decision to make, but look at those signs. And now I can't tell you by leaps and bounds how he has grown. And I'm so glad and so thankful that I made that decision.
So
that's an amazing story. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Kim, but thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. And we look forward to staying in touch with you.
So we are over time, but I do want the closing comment. I have to acknowledge that we've spoken to the elite in our community on this panel. We've also talked behind the scenes about how many times we have Black administrators in the schools who also have been conditioned and are not necessarily the best advocates for our children. So 30 seconds to each person on the panel before we close out. How can Black administrators and mental health professionals unite for change? I'll start with Ms. Williams.
We can change the schedule. That's what we did. We carved out time for mental health professionals to be able to work with our students and to be able to build that community in that safe space, like Dr. Franklin said. So most important thing is it's just acknowledging that the mental aspect is as good as the academic aspect that needs to be addressed with the student to address the whole child.
Okay. Ms. Hughes?
I think like this organization is really a model for administrators, Black administrators within education. And I feel like we need to get together and talk about changes that need to be made within the organization. I know many Black administrators are afraid to rock the boat, but if we get together and we support each other and we unite, I think change will happen. Just like you guys are doing here with MEB. I think Black administrators need to have an organization like that so that they can get together and be supportive of each other and advocate for change, because there are strength in numbers.
Ms. Haynes Buchanan?
I would say be willing to change your mind, your heart, and be real mindful, your mindfulness, because in order to do something different, it takes a new mindset for the parent, the healthcare provider, and the educator to all get together on one page, have an inclusive collaboration, respectful of each other's roles and responsibilities, and to address the needs of a whole child. And I think sometimes it's real choppy because there's a disconnect. But I think if we can all agree to this inclusiveness, I think it'll benefit the parent and the child more.
Dr. Franklin, I'm gonna give you 35 seconds because I know this is your passion. So go ahead. You have to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, so let's be honest, we're hurting as administrators and people of color, mental health therapists in the system. I mean, we want to cry, cuss, fuss, and fight ourselves. We want to choke people ourselves. We need a clearing. We need a place where we can just go the heck off because it is insane. Oh my God, how do we live and allow ourselves to tolerate what they're doing to our children and we're looking at it? I feel like I need to be whipped because I'm exposed to it. And you know, so, but thank God I'm the most hated man on campus because I have a voice and I don't mind being hated. I expect to be stoned, but we need a community. And you know, I want to organize our own mental health therapists and get our own licensure. Oh my God, if we did that, it would be over with because our opinions would then matter. We wouldn't have to suffer under these horrible licensure environments. We wouldn't have to suffer under their credentials. They would have to accept our credentials because of who we are and where we've been and how we've been trained and how unique our experience is to ourselves. So please, if we can just come together and start organizing our own clinical criteria for licensure, and then maybe they would ask for us, our expertise in this particular area. So I think we need to heal first before we try to heal other folk.
Good point. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for lending your expertise. Thank you for watching, tuning in, the questions, the conversation. It has truly been amazing. This is not the end of the conversation. Please visit mobunited.org for our mental health toolkit. If you need to find a provider, find information. You can also find me at specialneeds@mobunited.org. We are also looking to hear from our boys themselves. I have to say, as we continue to talk about the mistrust and the distrust in our community, we've been soliciting since the middle of April for young men to come forward and tell their stories of how they are managing their mental illness and continuing to thrive in our community. And we have not had one person sign up. I think that speaks volumes for the way that our community hides their mental illness and the taboo that's associated with it. So if you want to tell your story, please let us know. We want to hear it. We want to highlight and celebrate you. With that, I will end.
And we have one person in chat who's volunteering. So follow up. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. So we'll definitely follow up with that person. And I thank you again. Thank you for joining us this Saturday morning. You guys enjoy the rest of your weekend. And happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day. Thanks.
Happy Mother's Day.
Bye-bye.